We left off in our last video with Howard's sawmill, and I told you in this last video that this would be a good point to talk about the lumbering industry and the effect it had on Port Huron, which is what we're going to do in this video. Lumber was the first industry to have a major impact on Port Huron. St. Clair County had a wealth of pine, all different types. It also had hardwoods such as maple, oak, and walnut. And Port Huron was also strategically situated to particularly benefit from the cutting of these trees because it was located at the mouth of Black River. The Black River flows south from just west of Palms in Sanilac County to Port Huron, a span of 56 miles. The importance of this relationship lies in the use of the river by the lumbermen to float the cut logs downriver to the sawmills, where they were then processed. This is why so many of the older pictures you see of Black River and Port Huron is filled with logs, because it was a very common occurrence. This is just east of Military Street Bridge. You can see the logs floating there in the river. And then you can see the federal building there in the background, looking south on Black River. The amount of lumber from the north, termed Black River Gold, reached 64 million feet in 1869. So why were these lumber barons getting so wealthy? Well, look at this right here, this pine tree here. This was the type of tree that they were cutting down. They were over 300 years old, and they were probably, this one here is only about 4 foot wide, but they went as diameter-wise as much as 8 feet wide. And if you can look at this tree and see how much that you can get out of one tree. For example, it says here that there's enough lumber in this tree to build a 5-room home. Of course, I took this picture over 50 years ago, so I think the dollar value would be more than $3,000 today. This photo was taken at Hartwick Pines in Michigan. During the 1800s, Michigan forests yielded more money and created more millionaires than did all the gold mined during the California gold rush. And in turn, this wealth trickled down to Port Huron. It was a boom for Port Huron. Businesses started to grow, more stores developed, and more trade was going on in Port Huron. Not only locally, but being shipped out. It became a port. So it was earning its name, Port Huron. In the 1871 Port Huron Directory, there are about 30 lumbermen listed in the Port Huron area. In the downtown Port Huron area alone, between the mouth of Black River and 10th Street, there were 6 sawmills indicated by these red rectangles. And the sawmills continued all the way up past the canal. The first sawmills in the area were owned by Frenchmen back in the 1700s. By 1840, it was apparent that the traditional source of white pine in Maine and New York could not supply the growing demand for lumber. Michigan, the next state west in the northern pine belt, was the logical place to turn for more lumber. The production of Michigan lumber increased dramatically during the middle decades of the 19th century. The early sawmills were water-powered by necessity. They would dam up the water source, and then they would put a chute going to the water wheel so they could control the volume of water going through there. And as that wheel turned, it in turn would engage cogs that would engage saws. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think this illustration pretty much helps you to understand how those saws would work. As that wheel went around powered by the water, it in turn powered 2 different saws, A and B. Most trees were felled by axes until the 1870s, when cross-cut saws were improved so that they could be used to cut down standing timber. That was one of 2 Michigan-initiated innovations of the 1870s that were responsible for the largest increases in logging production. The second innovation that increased production was very large wheels, or a set of wheels, I should say. This picture was also taken at Hartwick Pines over 50 years ago. I had no idea what these wheels are for, and pretty much didn't care. I was just newly married. I was more interested in the young lady taking the picture, my wife. But in doing my research, I found out what they are for. The reason it was such a great innovation is because it was very difficult to get the large trees out, and or multiple trees for that matter, and dragging them by horse through the woods into the river. And you can see some of these large logs here. It would be very difficult for a horse even to pull without the help of wheels. I have some video clips I'd like to show you. They're quite rare actually, not from the 1800s but the 1900s, but the application would be the same. It'll give you a good idea what the logging people went through during that time. This photo shows how they pulled the logs before the big wheels, and this next clip shows a horse doing the same thing, pulling the log. If I were a horse, I'd be very thankful for those big wheels. The lumber barons bought huge tracts of land up along the Black River, and the river was dotted with lumber camps all the way up, at least until they exhausted the trees along the Black River, and then they had to move farther inland. The logging camp consisted of a bunkhouse or two, a kitchen and dining area, and possibly an office for the bosses. Sometimes there'd be 25 to 30 men in a bunkhouse, 50 to 60 men in the camp, plus the bosses and the cooks, and perhaps a wife or two along the way. Most cooks in the lumber company were men. Here we see a photo of a cook that looks like it might be with his son. But in some camps, the women were the cooks. I imagine they were the best cooks. Originally, the lumber industry was a seasonal affair, but later on, when they went for productivity, they realized that if they worked year-round, how much more they could get. And there were some advantages to working in the winter, too. Some of the swamp land around the river was easier to work with when it was frozen. Also, when the snow and the ice melt, the river would be at the highest level, which made it easier to drive the logs downstream. The life of a lumberjack was not an easy one. They worked long hours, they worked hard, and the work was dangerous, as we'll see later on in this video. But in most lumber camps, they were fed pretty well. Most of the time, they ate 4 times a day. Their first meal would be breakfast at 4 o'clock in the morning. Their first lunch would be 9 o'clock in the morning. Their second lunch would be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Then they'd have supper whenever they got in at night. Breakfast and the supper were served in these large dining rooms, such as these shown in these photos. But the lunches were usually taken to where the men were working, depending on the distance from the camp. Here the men are making kindling for the bean hole, and filled with kindling. It was 3 feet across. A cast iron pot would be filled with beans, and then they would take that cast iron pot filled with beans and put it into this hole. And then when the beans were done, after sitting almost all day, they would go ahead and pull it back out again. The loggers ate a lot of beans. Something else they ate a lot of was donuts. Here you see the cook making the donuts, and it said that the crew could eat about a half a barrel per meal. It's a lot of donuts. I think the cook thought so too. This wasn't the main camp, this was the working camp, and you see the men getting ready to enjoy the fruits of the cook's labor. And here they are just sitting around having their meal. Even the cook got a chance to take a break once in a while. In the second video on lumbering, we'll see how they worked in the snow in the woods. We'll also see the similarities between a cattle drive and a logging drive, and we'll also see why the key axeman was the most respected figure in the logging camp.